Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Antonio Cavedoni, and I am here to present to you about typography and fonts. I am a type designer at Apple. So on the agenda today, we will look at San Francisco and update on our system fonts. We will see some terminology about typography. We will look at some typographic concepts, and then tools that you have available when doing typography. Lastly, we'll see some details that you may want to adopt while working on your apps. OK, so San Francisco. It is our family of system fonts. We introduced them last year. This is SF, you see right here. And it is the system font for macOS, iOS, and tvOS. We introduced this family here at WWDC. Last year, there is a video that talks about the philosophy and the application of SF. And we've been applying it to all our platforms. So Apple TV, we've been applying San Francisco to Maps, but we've also been applying it to the redesigned Music app. Now, in case you haven't seen it all around you here in Moscone Center, there is indeed a new member of the SF family, and it is called SF Mono. SF Mono is a new design for coding. And it comes in many weights. We started with the lightweight, up to regular, medium, semi-bold. And then we're going to more expressive weights like bold and even a heavy. So all these come with italics as well. And they cover the Latin, extended Latin script, but also the Cyrillic and the Greek script in all the styles and all the weights with italics. So SF Mono is a monospace design, of course, but it's also monospaced across weights, which means that if you change your font weight, the text will not reflow. Of course, this was a bit of a challenge when we're designing this heavy weight, so we had to squeeze all these glyphs in. But we designed SF Mono for coding and small sizes first, and so we tweaked some of the glyphs, like the punctuation or the bracket, braces, some of the digits for use in coding. And of course, SF Mono is the new default font of choice of Swift Playgrounds. It is also the new default in Xcode. Check out the new theme right there. OK, so that was a small update on San Francisco and the new SF Mono family. Next, I want to talk to you about some type terminology, get us all on the same page on these terms about type that can be confusing at times. So before I get started, I just want to make a premise here, which is that today we will look at the Latin, Cyrillic, and Greek scripts. But if you're interested in multilingual typography, and you should, there were actually 2 talks yesterday that you can catch on video that talk exactly about this topic. So let's get started. What is text? Text encodes language and has to do with meaning. Text is the stuff that you type. It is the stuff that gets autocorrected and analyzed and sent to your friends. Now, what is text made of? It is made of, characters. A character is an abstract unit of text, and it literally is represented by a code. Now, before you can actually see one of these, you need a representation for it, which is called a glyph. A glyph is stored on your device as an outline, a sequence of points. And it lives inside a font file. Now, in a font file, between a character and a glyph, there usually is a one-to-one mapping. However, things are not always this simple. There could be something called typographic feature, which is a mechanism that alters this one-to-one mapping and makes things slightly more complex. For instance, you could have fonts that when you type the key for F or I, this character gets generated. And instead of getting 2 glyphs, you actually get just 1, because they get combined into what is called a ligature. Now, this ligature is made possible by a typographic feature, which is automatic and font dependent. Not all fonts do this. Some fonts have optional features that change the shape of digits. For instance, San Francisco has this alternate shape for the numeral 6. that we use when we want to make it a little bit more legible. Now, fonts have multiple styles, which of course look all different. Some fonts have just 2 styles. Some fonts have many, many more. And you may have heard some of their names like bold, italic, condense. All these are style names. Now, what holds all of these together is this design DNA, if you will, and that is the idea of a set of shapes. That is a typeface. There are many, many typefaces, and you may have seen or recognized some of these. Now, what you do with typefaces is typography. Typography is using type to set text and encode language. Typography is the foundation of graphic design and of UI design. So we just saw a few terms. We saw text. Text is made of characters. Characters are encoded by or represented by glyphs. Between characters and glyphs, typographic features can alter the mapping between these. They're all stored in what is called a font file, which can come in multiple styles. They are all grouped under the same typeface umbrella, which is the design idea behind all these styles. And typography is the usage of all of this stuff to convey text. Now, writers and editors, the people who write the text, concern themselves with text. The characters are defined by the Unicode Consortium, so you don't have to think about them. And the type designers and font manufacturers are the people who come up with the design ideas and design the glyphs and make them into fonts and then create the typographic features that you can then alter. Now, typographers are the people who do typography. And I have some good news for you, which is that you are typographers. As a matter of fact, we are all typographers. Whenever we change a font, whenever we make it bold, we change the point size, this is all the act of typography. Now, as typographers, of course, you do typography. But you can also alter the text, of course, and pick fonts, choose them, combine the styles, and alter the typographic feature. Turn the optional ones on. OK, I am almost done, but I have a few more terms. And they actually have to do with the absence of something, with the negative space around things. So I just showed you what a glyph is, which is an outline that represents a character. And in a font, it's stored as an outline, but it also has a width, basically a spacing property. Now, if I take that A and a space like this, and I typeset it in a line, I get this rhythm, which is not very even. So type designers alter this to get an even rhythm between glyphs. Spacing is built into the font, and you cannot really change it, but you can change tracking. Tracking is a modifier on the native spacing, and it can be either neutral, or negative, or positive. And it is global per all the glyphs in a font, and it either moves them apart or put them further together, which is actually useful when you're doing small-size typography. You probably want to bring the letters further apart and closer together when they're large. Now, tracking can be confused with what is known as kerning. And kerning really is an exception mechanism for individual pairs of glyphs. So in this case, that A and V are too far, and so the font has a kerning table inside that says, bring them closer together. The kerning table, again, is done by the type designer and put inside of the font. You don't control it. It just happens automatically. However, leading, which is the space between the lines, is something you can control. So the name leading comes from metal typography, when to put lines of type further apart, pardon me, you would have to stick pieces of metal between the lines. So we just saw spacing, tracking, kerning, and leading. Spacing and kerning are embedded in the font, but tracking and leading are adjustable. And that is really all I have to say on type terms. So now you are all caught up with typographic terms. Now let's look at some concepts of typography. We start with legibility. Legibility has to do with recognizing shapes and distinguishing them from one another. You may be familiar with the idea that some typefaces have inherent legibility to them. However, what is not legible at one size is actually perfectly legible at another size. Scale is connected with legibility. And when you alter the scale of a piece of text, details that were previously unavailable and not visible become visible. So what is affected is the tone of what you see. Now, in these situations, UI typography can be a lot like road signage. So you're driving on the road, and the sign that you see is very large, it's point size, but it's far away from you. And so scale is not just a matter of point size, but also of distance from the reader to the viewing surface, to the reading surface. Now, in these situations, things that apply to small-scale typography also apply as well. So, for instance, bringing letters further apart or making the type bolder may actually improve legibility. But legibility does not just apply to text. It also applies to layouts. It's probably fairly obvious that a layout that is legible, where a hierarchy is clear at one scale, may not be so legible at another scale. And the issue there is that density gets compromised. It actually increases very much. So what you could do to tame the density is you could spread elements further apart, but oftentimes it's actually much better to rethink your hierarchy and the positioning of things, your layout, for different scales. Now, if you want to know more about layout, there is a talk on Friday that talks about iterative UI design, which is a methodology to come up with ideas. And also, they'll have tips on how to evaluate these ideas, which is the important part. Now, scale and density, they also apply not just to text and layouts, but also to glyph design. So let me give you an example. What is this glyph? What is it called? Of course, it's the @ sign, but in Italy we have a strange name for it. We call it chiocciola, which means snail. So when we had to design the snail in San Francisco, we started, SF Mono, sorry. We started with the one in San Francisco, and of course we did this, right? We made it monospaced. However, when we evaluated the shape in the right context and scale, we realized that density was too high. It was just getting muddy and not very legible. So we came up with a solution that looks like this. Now let me blow it up. So in this example, we changed the density of that glyph by very much. And we did that by increasing the negative space, which is really critical for legibility. Now, consider also the H, M, and N glyphs in SF Mono Heavy. Now, if I blow them up really big, you can probably tell that the strokes aren't actually the same thickness. And that is because when they're big, you can actually tell, but when they're small, you cannot. So we're sort of deceiving you into thinking that they have the same density. OK, so imagine you're getting parachuted into this picture, and you're trying to figure out where you are and where you're trying to go. You're probably going to Subway somewhere, probably Church Avenue. But where are you? I know where you are. You're in New York, and I know by the font. Now, I also happen to know, I know, I'm sorry. I also happen to know that this is not exactly Helvetica that they're using, so I recreated that sign with Helvetica Neue Bold. But what I'm trying to convey here is this notion of typographic voice, which is that if you change a typeface to a different style, even within the same family, not only does that sign not work the same way, but it doesn't feel the same, OK? So typefaces have this voice quality. This does not feel like New York to me at all, and nor does this one. So this voice property is not secondary, and actually it helps creating a context. So for instance, I am reading my email in SF, and now I'm playing a game. Maybe that's not so appropriate to have SF in there. So typefaces really help you with creating a context and helping your user understand where they are. OK, so these are the concepts that we just saw. We saw legibility, scale, density, and voice. So now I want to talk to you about some tools. When doing typography in our platforms, you have 3 fundamental tools that you can use. The first one is System Font. The second one is Dynamic Type. And the third one is our custom fonts. Now, System Font, you already saw, is native to the platform, and it feels native to the platform as a typeface. To access it, the System Font APIs are the same between iOS, watchOS, tvOS, and macOS. So NSFont and UIFont basically have the same APIs. And they have a lot of benefits. They give you access to the weights of San Francisco, all the 9 weights, but also to the site-specific tracking. Basically, the letters move closer together or further apart automatically, depending on the point size that you request the system font at. You also get site-specific outlines automatically. And you get access for the bold text switch, which is something in the settings in iOS. People can turn it on, and it makes the text on all their devices bold. Now, the second tool you have available is Dynamic Type, and it's a great tool. It's available on iOS and watchOS. And Dynamic Type is really 2 things. The first one is the text styles APIs, preferred font for text style. And these give you access to semantic identifiers that give you fonts that are specific for that purpose. So you can request a font for headline or body or these, and you get fonts that look like the system, but they're tweaked for that one purpose. But Dynamic Type is also the content size categories, which you may be familiar with as the notches in this slider. So people can go in their settings, they can move the slider up and down, and they can change the global point size of their device. It's a great accessibility feature. Now, if you use Dynamic Type and use the text styles APIs, Dynamic Type support is automatic with these. However, if you're using custom fonts or you're calling system font directly, then you have to do some work to implement Dynamic Type, but it's really easy. And let me show you how that works. First, you have to pick or bundle a font. Then you can have a lookup table somewhere with the content size categories. Then you have to override this trait collection did change. This is a method of UI view and UI view controller subclasses. Then you update your fonts and paragraph styles, and you relay out, and you're done. So let's see these steps a little bit closer. How do you actually bundle a font in your app? Well, that's easy. You just drag it into Xcode, and then you declare the font names in the info plist. There is a key for it. Now, for the content size categories, you have to, of course, have a lookup table that maps them into point sizes and possibly weights or tracking values or even leading, depending on the typeface that you chose. So I have a lookup table that looks something like this. I have a tuple of point size, style name, leading, and tracking. And the symbols that you see there are the content size categories. Notice that there are actually more than the notches in the slider because there's 5 accessibility ones that are people can turn on in their accessibility settings. So when you run this lookup table, remember about these as well. Now, once you have that, you just override this trait collection did change method. And inside of there, you can do whatever. You can have code that, depending on the view you have and whatever it looks like, can adjust the fonts and then relay out. So when you're inside of that method, you should query the trait collection of the current object and look up the preferred content size category. And then you just use that as the key of your lookup table, and you're done. Now, step 5 is relay out, but if you're using auto layout, there actually is no step 5. If you're interested in knowing about auto layout, there are sessions on tomorrow and on Friday about this specific topic. All right, so we just saw how to make Dynamic Type work with custom fonts. But imagine you want to get started with this. How do you actually go about it? Now, if you're getting started and you're trying to use custom fonts, I recommend starting with one typeface at a time. It's actually much easier that way. But more importantly, once you have a typeface that you're considering, try to understand its design intention, because it really helps you out in usage. Typefaces are tools. They are designed by people for specific purposes, and understanding that purpose greatly helps you as the user of the font, as the typographer, actually. And also consider knobs you can turn, right? Kerning is not something you can actually easily alter from your app context. So if the font has no kerning, well, you may want to consider something else. However, if the font has leading that is too tight, you can actually alter that. So no worries. All right, so we just saw system font, we saw dynamic type, and we saw custom fonts. So next, I want to show you some small details that you may want to consider using in your own apps. The first one I want to show is arrows. Arrows are a great thing. They are useful for pointing to stuff, but also they're useful in complications where the information density is very high and you want to give just a little bit more of information. Now, arrows in SF, they're actually stored in the font as characters, so you can copy and paste them in your strings, in Xcode, for instance, and they will just show up. But more importantly, because they're in the font, they are weight matched with system font, and if people change their bold text switch or use dynamic type, the arrows will scale accordingly. Now, the second deal I want to talk to you about is high legibility alternates. I talked about alternate typographic features, and we have a new one in San Francisco, which helps in situations like this. You're typesetting a string where the context is actually not enough to tell which glyph is which. And maybe people have to pass this around or type it somewhere else. They have to read it and be completely, it has to be unambiguous which glyph is which one. So there's a new stylistic set that changes the shape of these glyphs to completely unambiguous ones. So the I gets a serif, the 0 gets a slash, the L gets a little tail, and the 6 is less confusable from the 8. Now, these shapes, we don't recommend turning them on all the time because, as you can see, they're big changes and they're highly disruptive of the overall texture and look and feel, actually, of text as well. So use them sparingly if you can. But this is the code to turn them on. And this code, by the way, works the same for UI font and NS font. It's exactly the same. You start with the UI font or something. You derive a font descriptor out of it. And then you can modify it, adding features to it, and then derive another font out of it. Next is small caps. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with capital letters and lowercase letters as well, but there is a third member of this group, which is small caps. Now, small caps are a smaller version of the capital letters that align with the lowercase. And when I say align, I mean almost align. They're actually optically slightly larger. Now, when are they useful? Well, when you're typesetting things like acronym, for instance, acronyms, or when you want to create subtle information hierarchies, like you have a number, and then you want to de-emphasize another piece of information next to it. Let me show you a case study of how we use small caps on Apple TV. Now, you have this paragraph, and you have a hierarchy of like a list on the left-hand side and a paragraph on the right-hand side, and you want that text on the top left to be a header, to stand out a little bit. Now, if you look at this as a wireframe, you can kind of start telling that that string in all caps is sort of trumping everything else in height. It looks a little bit too large. Now, one thing you could do to tame that is you could change the point size and bring it down. But if you did that, you would also make the letters lighter and too close. So the density will start to be not matched with everything else. So what you can do? Small caps. Small caps preserve that all caps setting, but they also preserve the density that you want and the stroke thickness. Now, there are two fundamental ways, two APIs actually, to get small caps in our systems. And they have to do with the interaction between the typographic features and the underlying text. So imagine you have a piece of text which is all uppercase, and you're turning on the small caps from uppercase feature, you get a piece of text that is all small caps. This looks good. Now, if you have a string that is mixed case, upper and lower case, and you turn on the small caps from uppercase feature, you get this. This does not look good. The problem with this one is that the capital letters are not really emphasizing anything, and they almost look like a mistake. So please try not to do this if you can. And lastly, if you have a string that is all lowercase, and you turn on the small caps from uppercase feature, you get all lowercase, which is not what you would expect, but at least it doesn't look bad. So we're fine. Now, the small caps from uppercase feature the code is exactly the same as the feature code that I showed you earlier for the high legibility alternates. And you just have to change the feature identifier and the selector. Now, there's another way of getting small caps, and it's from a lowercase piece of text. Now, sorry, if you have an all uppercase string and you turn on small caps from lowercase, you get all uppercase, which again is not really what you would expect, but at least it doesn't look bad. Now, when you turn on small caps from lowercase on a mixed case string, you get this. You get a mixed caps and small caps string, which is legitimate. We actually do use this in maps, for instance, at certain zoom levels. Small caps are really about subtlety, and this is one way to create a subtle hierarchy, for instance. So again, this is fine. Now, if you have an all lowercase string and you turn on the small caps from lowercase, you get all small caps, which is just fine. So again, the code to do this is exactly the same. I just changed that piece of code right there. And one thing you can do with features, you can actually turn multiples at once. So depending where you got that piece of text from, if it's under your control, if it's user editable, you may want to turn both at once as well, for instance. Now, there's one subtlety about small caps, which is, well, they're about subtlety, but there's something subtle about them as well, which is that they also operate not just on capital letters, but also on numbers and punctuation. And you may be wondering why. The reason is because you may have a string that looks like this, and you want to turn that all into small caps. So we support small cap numbers, small cap punctuation, and all of these in system font. All right, so we just saw some details of typography, like arrows, high legibility alternates, and small caps. And that's really all we have for today. We just saw the San Francisco fonts and an update there with the new SF Mono family for coding. We hope you enjoy it. We saw some terminology. We looked at some typographic concept, design-wise, and design concepts. And then we looked at some tools. And lastly, we saw some details, some small new features that you may want to adopt in your apps. Now, for more information, at this URL, you'll find the video of this talk, but you'll also find a bibliography and some references to sites that can get you started in your new journey as typographers. And there are also related sessions. These have yet to happen, are throughout the week. There is, the first session is actually introducing a tool that will greatly help you with dynamic type, but I don't want to spoil it. The other two sessions have to do with making your apps adaptive, so auto layout topics. The iterative UI design gives you some elements of design and of how to evaluate it as well. And then the What's New in Auto Layout session on Friday is really good too. And that's it. Thank you very much.